Thanks very much. It's really a great pleasure to be able to introduce this evening's speaker, Joshua Ehrlich, Josh, who's currently an assistant professor of history at the University of Macau, and previously he's studied at Chicago, where he gained his BA, and at Harvard University, where he gained an MA and his PhD. As we've just heard, he's worked extensively on the history of knowledge, also on political thought, on the British Empire more generally, and on South and Southeast Asia. And he's written articles on, for example, British India, the port city of Calcutta, and Indian print culture. And recently he masterminded a conference at the University of Macau on port cities, coasts, and on borders. But he's best known for his Cambridge University Press book, The East India Company and the Politics of Knowledge. And I did have the pleasure of reading this before publication. I'm very impressed at how Josh is able to communicate a complex, and to me it was an unfamiliar area, in a very engaging and thoughtful and insightful way. And he moves from the colonial economy and really the East India Company as the sort of one of the commercial wings of the British Empire, perhaps, in the same way that casinos are part of the commercial wing of Macau. But he moves into the economy of knowledge, and so how information and communication becomes central to the East India Company's project. I'm sure he's going to tell us much more about that, but it's very appropriate that we're in this particular place for this particular talk on the East India Company. One of the things that I found particularly interesting about his work is how it touches on so many different aspects of 18th and 19th century society and culture, and you may well find that some of the names that you hear are familiar to you in other areas. So, without more ado, thanks very much indeed, Josh.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that kind introduction. And thanks really to Ricardo and Katerina for patiently organizing this with me. I long ago had said to many people that I have to do my book launch at the Casa Garden. It's the place that was really the headquarters of the East India Company locally in Macau. So I can't launch the book anywhere else. And so I'm happy to have that dream becoming reality today, really. And as Nick said, this book is a combination of things. It's a history of knowledge, a history of political thought, also a history of empire, a history of corporate empire. And I'm going to try to explain and unpick these different elements in the talk over the next half hour or so. I might need some help changing slides here. Okay. So I think the contemporary landscape, the contemporary sort of context for this book is a wealth of studies of corporate involvement in different areas of knowledge, ranging from lower and higher education to scientific research to publishing. In all of these fields, there's a sense reinforced by dozens, maybe hundreds of these books now over the past couple decades, that corporations are becoming involved as never before in areas of knowledge that we think of as domains of the state. So we would think perhaps that the state is responsible for education and always has been. The state takes the lead when it comes to scientific research, providing grants and providing institutions for scientists to do their work. And that the state really is funding the universities that then are responsible for academic publishing and for publishing the results of the scientists. The scientific journals are coming out of these universities, etc. And all of that we think has been shaken up only in recent times. We see the massive profits of Elsevier, which anyone at a university is familiar with how much their academic journals cost, and the profit margins being greater than Apple or Google's. We think of edtech as something very new, the kind of use of software developed by companies in the classroom. We think of all of this as something really shaking up what had come before, shaking up an environment where the state is broadly responsible for knowledge. Knowledge is a public good, not a private one. Corporate involvement is kind of secondary to the leadership provided by the state. That's what we think. However, actually, the state-led knowledge order that we take for granted, the state's leadership in these affairs, is quite a recent phenomenon, dating back no earlier than the 19th century. To take that leading role, the state had to contend with corporations, largely, involved in what we would now call corporate social responsibility. And one of those corporations, maybe the dominant one in world history, not only when it came to making profits, but when it came to knowledge activities like education and science and scholarship, was the East India Company. That's the subject of my book. So one role this book has, one job it has, is reminding us of this long history of corporate involvement in knowledge and debates around that involvement. Debates over the respective roles of states and companies when it comes to science or education or publishing. And questions that we might have now over the proper roles of states and corporations when it comes to knowledge are not really so new and would benefit from recovering some of those earlier debates over these issues, recovering resources from the past. That really is one goal of my book. But I want to take you back 10 years to when I first started working on this book and how I initially got into this topic and the questions it raised, and I'll kind of go through the story of the East India Company's deep involvement with knowledge. I came across, as a lowly graduate student, a position many in the room can maybe empathize with. I see some of my graduate students here. I was looking around, reading what I could, coming up with a topic, and I came across this quote. This comes from Jacques-Pierre Brissot, who would later be involved in the French Revolution. At the time, in 1783, he was living across the Channel in London. He was starting a new learned society, which he hoped would gather the world's information, publish it, make it available to scholars. And he was emulating the great philosophes of his time, the grand philosophers of Paris, the Rousseaus and Voltaires and those much more prominent names. Here's what he wrote. Commerce may be rendered subservient to the promotion of science. And the same ship that carries the East India Company's orders to Calcutta may likewise carry the new instruments or the new work, and may bring back the Indian book for the student of Göttingen or the professor of Oriental languages at Paris. This raised instantly all kinds of questions for me. The 1780s was a moment when the East India Company was expanding through conquest and treaty making across India. It was no longer merely a merchant. It had become the ruler of a big empire. And it was coming under huge criticism for these activities, its extraction of profits, its violence and conquest. So to find it here, celebrated at least potentially as an enlightened transmitter of knowledge, really and still in a mercantile form, in the form of a merchant, trading knowledge here and there, bringing scientific instruments, bringing books back and forth, trading in knowledge as well as in material goods. This was quite surprising coming at this moment, knowing what I did about the East India Company. I soon found that, sure enough, Brissot was not saying something very original. He was sort of a magpie, picking up things here and there. He was echoing rhetoric being used by the East India Company itself at this time to justify its activities, to justify its new possession of territory, to justify its continued combination of political and economic power, this controversial union of functions by the 1780s. To understand why the company was doing this and to understand the purchase this had at the time politically, I would have to return to some basic questions about what the East India Company was, about how it was really involved with knowledge, and how it was using it for political reasons. So perhaps I should start by saying a little bit more about the East India Company. Not everybody has been as steeped in it as I was when I came across that quote. So let me tell you a little bit about it, and then you can kind of see how knowledge played this incredibly central role for the company as it entered this controversial, contested, embattled period from the 1770s to the 1850s, the period of my book. The East India Company is often remembered today as the world's most powerful corporation. This is the name of one of the many books about the company. It was founded in 1600 to manage English trade with Asia. Later, when England joined with Scotland, it became the British East India Company. Asia was called at the time the East Indies, and so it was a very broad geographical description, and it handled trade in India, Southeast Asia, ultimately China. But from the very beginning, the company was more than just a company. It was a company state. It had political as well as economic power and responsibilities. It could conduct diplomacy. It was empowered to do so in its charter. It could make agreements with rulers in Asia. It could raise armies to defend its trade. It could mint currency in its name. It could make and administer law, establish law courts to settle disputes and maintain the peace. And it can govern. It could govern at first the small trading posts that it established around the coasts of India and what's now Indonesia. But all of these political powers ultimately became much more important as the company grew from being a set of small trading posts into one of the largest territorial empires in world history. To show you what I mean, here's the company's territories in India. It gets started, one dispute with the local governor in Bengal, East India, in the 1750s, gives rise to its first large territorial possessions. You can see that here in 1765 when it's kind of establishing more and more direct control over that region. By 1805, it's expanded further into North and South India. It's also started picking up additional territories in Southeast Asia, places like Penang and Singapore. By the mid-19th century, and finally on the eve of its dissolution in 1857, it's the major power in India. Even those areas still colored yellow on this map are under the informal control, largely, of the company. And so it goes from being a sort of interloper in Indian politics to being the paramount power, the dominant political power in South Asia. It creates the British Raj. Formally, the crown takes over in 1858 after the Great Indian Uprising, rebellion. But the East India Company has already basically conquered South Asia, conquered India for Britain. Now, at the same time, it goes through this incredible transformation into a major territorial power, ruler of a great empire with maybe 100 million Indian subjects. It's also losing its commercial power. Its monopoly on the India trade, which had given it the exclusive right to trade between Britain and India, gets removed in 1813. It no longer is really competitive on that route between India and Britain. By 1833, it loses its monopoly on the China trade. The reason, of course, that it's in Macau is that this is where those traders who stay in Canton during the trading season can spend the off-season. Why was this the house of a merchant? Well, he needed somewhere to stay in Macau when he couldn't be in Canton, the place we're standing right now. So as the company becomes territorial, it becomes less and less commercial. This puts incredible strain on its dual constitution, its dual character as a company state, which it has to continue defending if it's going to survive. And it's in this pressurized atmosphere that it starts to turn to knowledge, that it starts to become invested in knowledge. I'll explain more. As the EIC, the East India Company, evolves into this large-scale territorial ruler, it struggles increasingly to justify this hybrid character as a company state. This looks more and more anomalous in the late 18th and early 19th century. There's pressure to dissolve the company, to make it only a merchant or only a sovereign. Its status as a merchant sovereign with political and economic power comes under greater and greater strain. And it turns in part to ideas about knowledge, to legitimize this kind of old hybrid character, anomalous as it may be by this time. So I show in my book that the company claimed to be not only the world's most powerful corporation, but also the world's most enlightened corporation. The founder of universities, the publisher of books, the sponsor of scientific expeditions, to name just a few of its scholarly commitments. I hasten to add that we might not believe this claim. The company was justly notorious even in its own day for extraction and violence. I don't mean to suggest that that's not true. But I do want to suggest that we should take these claims seriously at an ideological level. And I'll say what I mean by that. By ideology, I just mean a set of ideas that are used to legitimate political action. So I am, let's put me in the position of the East India Company. I'm trying to justify this enormous power. I need to have a set of ideas, a set of ways I present myself to do that. Now, the thing about ideology is it doesn't necessarily reflect the deepest, innermost beliefs of everybody that was adhering to and expressing that ideology. What it does do, however, is bind and shape action. So if I say I'm going to do something, and I say, this is what I really believe, this is my ideology, this is my set of values and principles, if I don't act in accordance with what I've said, well, this tends to hurt my credibility. It tends to delegitimize me. I might not be taken seriously. I might not have a lot of sway in political debates. So this is the importance of ideology. It shapes and binds action. And so the company, by committing itself to knowledge, did have to live up to those expectations it had set, at least to a certain extent. And critics of the company, when it didn't meet expectations, could point this out and push it to live up to its promises. I think it's this ideological character of the company's commitments to knowledge that really explains them. You know, at one level, the company had to find out about ocean currents for navigation. It had to learn the revenue systems in India so that it could administer the same lands. It had to learn Indian and Asian languages to communicate for trade and then for rule. So there's a practical component here. But there's also this ideological component. By setting itself up as this great patron of knowledge, the company set expectations that it actually had to live up to a certain extent. So what my book does is trace a history of ideas of knowledge, ideas of or about knowledge, that the company announced in this over and over and over again in this crucial period of its late history, from the 1770s to the 1850s. Again and again, it pointed to its role in spreading knowledge, cultivating knowledge, to justify its continued existence, to justify its character as both a state and a company. Only such a hybrid entity, it argued, could contribute to knowledge as it had and did. So I trace in these chapters in the book the various ideas of and about knowledge that the company used to legitimize itself. And I reconstruct the kind of debates over knowledge that the company engaged in with critics who often dismissed very strongly its claims to be enlightened and acting in the interests of humanity. As I've said at the beginning of this talk, one outcome of this kind of study is that we can hopefully situate this very seemingly new politics of knowledge, a recent phrase, in historical perspective. It seems so new and startling to us that companies should be involved in those areas I mentioned at the beginning. But really, there's a history to this, and we would learn from it. We would be better informed in debates in the present if we studied such debates in the past. We may indeed recover resources for use in our own knowledge debates. So what I want to do now is kind of briefly, and I'm going to try not to overwhelm you with detail, go through the chapters of my book and kind of tell this story about the company and its involvement with knowledge at a political and ideological level. There will be a number of names, and I will kind of explain the important ones. I will sort of mention some key episodes here as I go through and try not to deluge you with unfamiliar detail. But if I do pass over something quickly, I invite you to ask me more about it in the Q&A. I'm going to not take up the whole hour with my talk, but leave at least maybe 15 minutes for discussion. So my story starts in the 1770s. Why the 1770s? Well, this is when the company commits finally to governing directly in its Indian territories. It had conquered these in the 1750s and 60s, but pretended that it was really only acting as a kind of revenue collector for the native government that existed there. It does away with this fiction in the 1770s. And this puts it under increased pressure. It has to now justify this role it has in governing the huge territories of Bengal in eastern India. And it does this by turning to the patronage of scholars. The company had patronized scholars almost since its beginnings in 1600. It had, for instance, subscribed to grammars of Asian languages compiled by company officials. It had paid navigators to draw up hydrological charts. This kind of thing in a not very planned out but piecemeal way. There are new stakes to this from the 1770s. The company's first governor general, its leader in India, Warren Hastings, sets about compiling codes of Hindu and Islamic law. He founds colleges, a madrasa in Calcutta, the capital of the company in eastern India, Calcutta. And he sends expeditions to Bhutan and Tibet, lands almost unknown to Europeans. All of this, and many more things besides, are part of what he calls a system of conciliation. What he means is that by patronizing European scholar officials, these officials working for the company who are taking an interest in scholarship, as well as Indian learned elites, the pundits and Malvis, kind of Hindu and Islamic learned elites, he's going to gain support for the company among political classes and power holders, both in Britain and in India. The idea is that patronizing scholarship is seen as a good deed by pretty much everybody, both in Indian society and back in British society, especially at those upper levels among gentry and aristocrats who appreciate knowledge. Now, interestingly, this idea of patronizing scholars and thus conciliating political classes, winning them over, it's an idea that befits both a merchant and a sovereign. Okay, merchants trade, sovereigns patronize, so you can be seen to be doing both things if you're sponsoring scholarship. It's also rooted in both British and Indian political thought. In other words, there are ideas about scholarly patronage very deep-rooted in both traditions. It's seen as a good deed and part of establishing one's legitimacy in both Britain and India. This idea of patronizing scholars to conciliate opinion towards the company state is a mainstay of East India Company ideology for much of the next 6 decades. It survives, for instance, the famous impeachment trial of Hastings when he returns to Britain back in the late 1780s. He's put on trial for high crimes and misdemeanors, in Parliament. This is the scandal of its day in British politics. He's accused of incredible corruption, unbelievable violence, some of which is exaggerated, some of which has a certain basis in fact. And he tries to defend himself by saying, look at all the scholars I patronized. Look at all the colleges I established. I wasn't corrupt, I was enlightened. Now this may have a certain resonance back in Britain, but one problem Hastings faces is his successor, the temporary Governor General after him, John Macpherson. Now Macpherson is a son of the Scottish Enlightenment. He's coming out of a great intellectual tradition in Scotland, and he was taught by, for instance, Adam Ferguson, one of the luminaries of the 18th century. He was in correspondence and he was friends with Adam Smith, David Hume, names we may still know today. He was also deeply corrupt. And so while he claimed to be carrying on Hastings' scholarly patronage, there was a clear case to be made that he was simply making an excuse for his own corruption and profit skimming. So Hastings' scholarly patronage gets a bad name because of the actions of his successor. When the Calcutta Botanic Garden is founded, for instance, Macpherson offers the job of managing it to one of his cronies, and the crony responds in a letter I found, yeah, I'll do it if you make the thing worth my while, in words more or less like those. So there's clearly some ways that knowledge is being used here as a sort of veil for corruption, tending to then cast doubt on Hastings' own activities previously. But the next Governor General who comes along, Lord Cornwallis, fresh off of his defeat in the American Revolutionary War, he comes to, rather than reject scholarly patronage and conciliation, Hastings' idea, embrace them but try to purify them, remove this taint of corruption, restore them as honorable duties of the company. He finds an ally here in Sir William Jones, the polymath who's maybe remembered by some in the room or known to them as the founder of modern linguistics. Jones is the first one to see connections between ancient Sanskrit and ancient Greek and Persian. He finds these links which are really the basis for a lot of what philologers and later linguists come to believe about the origins of language. So William Jones signs on to this project of a purified scholarly patronage, removing any hint of corruption, carrying on scholarship at arm's length from the company. But still, by being in India in the company's service, William Jones is a judge, attesting to, demonstrating that the company has enlightened officials in its employment. By the mid-1790s, the French Revolution has happened. The kind of scrutiny and criticism back in Britain of the company has faded and given way to a new sort of patriotic embrace of the East India Company. Along with this rehabilitation of the company comes a rehabilitation of Hastings and a celebration of his scholarly commitments. The company faces a much greater challenge around the turn of the 19th century. I've mentioned a few governors general, the kind of leading officials in India, all of whom reinforced this commitment to patronizing scholars, starting scholarly institutions, publishing books, sending out scientific expeditions. Well, all of them were doing this to legitimize the company, legitimize its continued power as an economic and political force. Someone different comes along in 1798. Richard Wellesley is an enemy from within. He wants to undo the company that he nominally serves. And he, again, turns to knowledge to do this. He creates a college, the College of Fort William, that will train civil servants, but it has another sort of symbolic purpose, which is to end the rule of the East India Company and replace it with a proper, as he sees it, territorial, kingly sovereignty. He says, this is an enormous empire. Why is it being ruled from a counting house? With the ideas of a trader instead of a king. He sees himself really as that kind of king who's going to emerge from the company, do away with its structure, and create a new structure of imperial rule in India. And the college is his home base for this political project. The college is imagined on a grand scale. It's going to instill loyalty to him personally among the students. It's going to show the kind of pageantry of sovereignty at all of its activities. It's, in other words, an attack on the foundations of the company state. The directors of the company, its leaders back in London, quickly perceive the threat of this college. They try to demolish it. When this fails, it's checked by other authorities. They found a college of their own in Hertfordshire, in England, that's going to overshadow Wellesley's college. There's a sort of competition among these dueling colleges for a few years in the 1800s. Ultimately, Wellesley is replaced, the fight dies down, but the directors of the company, the leaders of the company, become deeply skeptical of scholarship. They see its subversive potential. Before it had seemed they would only legitimize themselves by patronizing scholars. Now they see that the work of scholars can be turned against them. Wellesley has shown them that. And this deep skepticism continues into the next decade and a half. In the 1800s and 1810s, scholar officials in India really taking up Wellesley's idea of an expansionist, aggressive, imperialist, really, power. They tailor their projects to this kind of territorial expansion, this embracing of empire, doing away with the old mercantile trappings of the company. The company's leaders back in London despair of this, cut off funding, try to reduce or end these projects. For instance, gathering through surveys information about peoples on the frontiers of the company's territory, making them open for expansion. The directors try to stop all of this. And yet, as they sour on scholarly patronage, seeing it as undermining their own foundations, the directors do get interested in Indian education. And this is the big shift I describe in the book, from a politics of knowledge focused on scholarly patronage, which is going to win over some key elites, to a politics of knowledge focused on education, which is going to appeal to much larger publics. With the company's dominance in India by the later 1810s comes a recognition of new responsibilities to govern. One of the ways the company can demonstrate its good government is by educating people, something that is a very new idea for states to be doing at this time. You don't get the first grant in Britain for public education until much later. Already the company is starting to support it by the 1820s. And that's the subject of the last chapter of my book. I talk about how in the 1820s to 30s, demands for good government from publics back in Britain scrutinizing the company and publics in India demanding education. These lead to debates over native education across India, from Bombay in the west to Delhi and Agra in the north, to Madras and Calcutta in the east, and even to Singapore, further east. You get this incredible amount of ink being spilled by the 1820s on the subject of education, how to create a system of education, what kind of education to provide, who to provide it to. And for all of the incredible breadth of these debates, they tend to center on this question of whether they should still be catering to elites or cultivating broader publics. It's this tension, I argue, that lies at the heart of a key debate in British imperial history, the Anglicist-Orientalist controversy of the 1830s. This is usually seen as a sort of cultural debate. It's a debate over language and whether to favor Eastern knowledge or Western knowledge, whether to educate Indians in their own traditions or impose Western European traditions. I argue, however, that there's a more deeply rooted social component here. It's really a debate over whether to continue catering to elites or start cultivating broader publics. And that's really the enduring legacy of the debate. The outcome of the debate in a famous minute, again, if you've studied any British imperial history, you've come across a document by Thomas Macaulay where he talks about the superiority of English and Western knowledge to Asian knowledge. It's this kind of a very chauvinist remark that's remembered and usually seen as the main point of this debate. But really the impact of that kind of claim is very short term. The lasting impact is the end of this idea of scholarly patronage and conciliation in the company's ideology, and its permanent replacement by ideas of mass education, public education. By the later 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, mass education is at the center of the company's claims to legitimacy, at the center of its ideology. As late as 1854, just a couple years before it's replaced by the Crown in India, it issues a grand intellectual charter, as it's nicknamed, where it's going to provide education for all of its subjects, ultimately, in a kind of rolled out fashion. This pledge is rolled back itself by the Raj, by the direct British government after 1857. It's not fulfilled. So that's the arc of the story I tell. Ideas about conciliating political classes through scholarly patronage, giving way, being challenged, expanded, contracted, debated, ultimately being replaced by a vision of public or mass education that the company links to its own legitimacy in India. Its right to rule is premised on its commitment to education. Now, I should add that it doesn't fulfill that commitment. It commits more to debating and talking about it than it does to funding it. But again, I think ideology matters. It says a lot about the ideas we inject into politics, and it binds those who commit to an ideology to act, at least under pressure, in accordance with it. So I want to conclude by saying a few things again about the sort of present day relevance of the story I've tried to briefly outline here. Our time, too, is one of corporate involvement with knowledge. And there are a few lessons for the present that we might draw from my account of the East India Company. Companies, we should remember, are not only economic in nature. That's as true today as it was 200 years ago. They're also political actors. They also have ideologies, or as we might call them today, mission statements. This makes them accountable to outside constituencies. So for all of us who may feel quite critical about corporate involvement in knowledge today, we should remember that those companies can be held to account for their promises. We should also remember something broader. The state, the company, knowledge itself, these are malleable categories. They've meant very different things over time. The things we think of as natural concerns of the state today only became seen that way very recently. The things we think of as the natural concerns of the company only became thought of as such very recently. These categories can be remade. Corporate involvement with knowledge, in fact, can be made to look very different than it does today. So thank you for listening to my talk, and I look forward to any questions about it.
Thank you very much indeed, Joshua. That's extremely eloquent and illuminating, and indeed an exemplary account of how history, historical research, can create a context and a perspective on current and contemporary issues, and show that in fact there is ways of looking at these things that actually engage with a whole story which not only has national but also international dimensions. So thank you very much indeed for that very illuminating account. Are there any questions, please? Yes, at the back.
I was just curious, when you look at the evolution of the EIC and the emphasis on education, was this priority also evident
Yeah, well, this is quite an interesting question of how the British East India Company's history maps onto or doesn't map onto the histories of all of its European competitors, of which the Dutch and French and even like Swedish and Danish and others could be named. The main difference is that none of those others grow into territorial empires. I do think, however, that from an early date, those other East India companies similarly position themselves as bringers of knowledge to Europe. So the Dutch East India Company is very much tied into the Dutch Golden Age, a golden age of bringing knowledge from other parts of the world back to Europe, and it positions itself that way for those publics and officials scrutinizing it back in the Netherlands. So that example, I think, in the early phase when the Dutch company is still quite powerful and has the power to position itself that way is instructive. I think in terms of the later period that I focus on especially, the British company has no real competitors. After the 7 Years' War, when the French company is kicked out of India essentially, or its aspirations are contained, the British company stands alone, and it uses that preeminence to say it's the only power that can fulfill this role as a global trader in knowledge. It's the only one that can do it because it's unmatched in commercial prowess and territorial extent.
Were there any competitors within the British Empire that ever attempted or came close to matching the British East India Company, or like made any progress within, not from different countries?
Yeah, well, on the trading front, there are these private traders continually trying to erode the company's monopoly, ultimately successfully. And they win, basically, in 1813 and again in 1833. It's interesting to think about this competition in terms of knowledge, because the company holds up knowledge as one of its great contributions to Britain and the world, again, for very political reasons. And you see criticism from its competitors back in Britain that actually it's doing a bad job of this, that its library in London is a shambles, it doesn't keep proper catalogs, something that researchers today can maybe relate to. And so you do see even this entering the politics of knowledge, where critics of the company can point to it not keeping proper care of its museum and library in London, not patronizing scholars properly, things like that, and saying if this were put in other hands, if the market were opened up, all of this knowledge would be more accessible. The company is keeping a monopoly on knowledge as well as on material goods. You see that kind of language used by critics.
Thanks for this wonderful presentation. My question is, I think it's very important that you highlight the transition of politics knowledge from patronizing to the building of schools and highlight of mass education. And I wonder, we know that from, since after the French Revolution, patronage did become not a popular option for knowledge production in Europe too. And I wonder to what extent that tendency of from patronage to mass education on the land between nation states, right, newly raised nation states, to the case of East India Company that you're talking about. What I mean by that is, which direction does the knowledge flow? Whether they come from East India Company to Europe, to the nation states, newly built nation states, or actually the nation states on the land that produced or inspired, or in whatever way that you can better frame this than me, and inspire and shift this knowledge and idea back to the company and let it flow.
And into India, are you asking that?
Yeah, and maybe to other countries in Asia too, because I work in China, so I see a lot of similar knowledge that were translated into Chinese and read by missionaries and written by missionaries to Chinese readers, and how translation also play a role in this change of politics and knowledge production. Thanks.
Yeah, interesting set of questions there. I think I have a few responses. I mean, one is when it comes to the role the company is playing compared with the roles taken by states in Europe, the company is really at the vanguard. I think because it faces such an acute legitimacy crisis, it has to be at the forefront of new strategies of legitimation. You know, it's exploring every possible way it can claim some kind of credibility under circumstances where it's continuously under threat of being closed and folded up. So it's a little bit before the state in taking a role in education. It's a little bit more aggressive in patronizing scholars than even the British state sometimes is back in Britain, and some supporters of the company point this out. So another question you raised is about which direction the knowledge is flowing. And I also found this quite interesting in my research, that I had expected to see maybe some change from valuing Indian knowledge more and bringing it to Europe, to valuing Indian knowledge more and bringing it, valuing European knowledge more and bringing it to India in the later phase. Actually, I find that throughout this period, the company is quite open to any kind of claims it can make. It's true that by the mid-19th century, there's a sort of increased confidence in Europe and in intellectual circles in Europe that they have the best knowledge. This comes along with the rise of the industrial economies and with the rise of global empires. And yet the company, I think, to the last, positions itself as really open to trading in any direction. It's a multi-directional kind of trade that it envisions and that it's saying it can foster. Yeah, cutting against some of those big changes in European confidence and arrogance.
Last question.
So in today's academic landscape, there's a focus on corporates funding academics, but for pragmatic purposes. So, for example, I can say Google came out of Stanford. A lot of the research papers nowadays are in collaboration. Like, for example, a tech company wouldn't fund a historian or a biologist, right? Because you mentioned Sir William Jones, right? And that has to do with linguistics, so it does have some pragmatical application, like studying linguistics might be useful for the company itself. Was there any bias when they were selecting academics, when they were deciding who to sponsor, for example, in terms of knowledge field?
Yeah, this is interesting, and it changes over time. So in the early days, Warren Hastings, the first embattled Governor General of Bengal, he's willing to patronize just about anybody, from poets to natural philosophers to philologists, pretty much anybody who's claiming to be engaged with scholarship, he will sponsor. As the company, really its leaders back in London, become more worried about how knowledge and these activities might undermine their position, they become much more focused on utility and saying only really the most practical and the most defensible on practical grounds kinds of knowledge will be given money by us. And they hold up these kinds of standards when judging applications for patronage, coming to them and coming to their governments in India. So by the 1800s, 1810s, the purse strings are being held a bit tighter, and the company is not simply paying any would-be claimant on their largesse. So yeah, it changes as the company's own politics of knowledge change.
On behalf of everybody here, I would like to thank you very much indeed, Josh, for a wonderful paper. Thank you.